All right, so I introduced concepts from fisheries economics last class. We didn't actually get into the economics last Friday, but I do want to build that into the analysis today. We started with the biology of fisheries population, like fish populations, and the way that they grow over time and the way that those growth rates depend on the size of the fish stock. I want to revisit that a tad at the beginning of today's class and then build in the economics, build in some of the things that we want to take into account when we're considering what the economically optimal pattern of fishing is. And then I want to get into some thoughts on designing policy for fisheries management. So it's kind of progression from biology to economics to policy for today's class. This is where we were. We were right here, roughly. The basic idea here is that we have three zones. We have this red zone at the bottom, which is sort of the danger zone, where if we get below X min, which is, you can think of this kind of like the minimum viable population, where if the population falls below that level, you sort of become at risk of spiraling off to extinction, just because the opportunities for reproducing, the opportunities for breeding are diminished as there are fewer and fewer fish. They have trouble finding each other, and so you get a potential downward spiral to extinction. But if you drop below that critical threshold of X min, which is sort of the minimum viable population. But if you're in a zone above that, if you're in the mid-range zone, like between X max and X min, this is the green zone. And the green zone means good. That means you have an opportunity to grow the population of fish. It'll start kind of growing at an increasing rate, and then you'd expect it to sort of flatten out as the stock grows and as they begin to compete with each other for resources. You'd expect that to naturally stabilize at some level, and that's what this stable equilibrium value is, X max. X max is kind of like the level at which the fish population will sort of naturally stabilize. And then we have the zone above X max, where if for some reason we have a temporary shock which allows the population to grow and exceed X max, there would be a tendency, because of the competition for limited food supplies for the fish, because of that competition, you'd expect the population, if it gets above X max temporarily, you'd expect it to kind of fall and revert back to X max. You get this reversion back to X max with either a positive or a negative shock. And then if the negative shock, if that happens to be extremely severe and large and it drops all the way down below X min, that's where you get, even if that shock is removed, you've dropped below the X min minimum viable population, and then the natural progression at that point will be to drop towards zero. Whereas even if the population only dropped, if it dropped severely but it was still above X min, you'd still have this tendency to revert back to X max, as long as you had something that was above X min. But it's sort of, once you get below X min, that's a critical threshold where you start to, the fish loses the capacity to sustain itself. That's some of the biology. And we had used this graph here, which was total population on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. I'm going to flip that around. I'm going to change the variables a little bit. Instead of time being on the x-axis, I'm going to take this total population variable and put that on the x-axis here. So now we have total population on the x-axis. And instead of time being explicitly on the y-axis, we have the growth rate. This is the additional fish that are added every single time period, or you can think of it as like every single year. Now, notice that the growth rate at x max, if we have a total population of x max, the growth rate is 0. So the additional fish that are introduced to the population are exactly canceled out by the older fish that die. And so the younger generation exactly replaces the older generation as they die out. And that's true for X max, but as soon as you drop below X max, there's some positive growth rate where the number of fish that are reproduced exceed the number of fish that die. And so what that implies is that there is some amount of harvesting that could take place that would still allow for an undiminished stock at the end of the year. So if you have a stock level at some intermediate range X, that's going to be associated with some positive growth rate. There's going to be some amount of fish that are going to be added to the stock according to this level. The level of this curve represents the additional fish on top, above and beyond X, that are added over that time interval. And so what that implies is that you could, if your population stock is at X, you have extra fish added equal to that vertical level represented by that green curve, and you could harvest that every single year, and your stock would still be maintained at X because you'd start the year at X, you'd have some additions over the course of the year, you would harvest some amount of fish equal to the additions, and you'd end up with X again at the start of the next year. So that's kind of you can think about any level of harvesting that's equal to the growth rate of the stock is going to be a sustainable level of fishing where that harvest amount is exactly equal to the new fish that are reproduced every single year. Yeah. So just to take an example, we have XH. I'm going to say this is XH. This is a relatively high stock level, high population level. That's why I have the subscript H to represent the word high. And again, that's associated with some amount of new fish per year. I'm going to call this H0. And so H0 represents the net gains to the fish stock from one year to the next. And so you could harvest H0. H0 is equal to the new additions, but you could also think of that as the amount of harvested fish that you could take out in a given year and still keep the stock level at XH. The stock would still be maintained at XH. That's one of the things that we can observe from this population growth rate curve, is that H0 is a possible sustainable harvest rate if the stock is equal to XH. Now there's actually two different stocks that are associated with H0. XH, if the stock is at XH, you'll have H0 number of fish reproduced each year above and beyond how many die out. You'll have H0 fish added to the population. That's also true. You'll also have H0 fish added if your stock level is XL. So XL is a smaller stock, but it's still a stock that's above X min, and so you still have natural growth in the population at XL, just in the same way that you do at XH. And in fact, the natural growth, the amount of extra fish that are added, is exactly the same at XL as it is at XH. So XL and XH both actually imply the same level of sustainable harvesting, because both those stocks result in the same additional fish added every single year. The question then is, or one question you could ask, one question that is interesting to think about is, which of these stocks is a better amount from an economic perspective? Would you rather have XL or XH?
I would say XL, because you have future growth rate, future positive growth rate, over time.
Oh, you're talking about you would be possible to maybe like move to the right and have this growth rate increase?
Yeah.
That's possible. Although you could also have the same thing at XH as well. You could have, if you shrunk the population, you could also have a way to kind of climb up the growth curve as well. So maybe that's an advantage of XL, but that would also actually be equally true at XH. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other ideas about why XL or XH might be a preferable?
Maybe XH, because it's already near its capacity. So if you extract that XH, I'm just saying my idea, but if you extract the XH, you're not really ruining future dividends or like the amount of fish because it's already reaching capacity. So
maybe, yeah, there's maybe a chance that, so XL is a little bit closer to X min, and maybe there could be a little bit of, if there's a mess up of some kind, you end up maybe moving towards extinction in that case. That's possible. Although that's sort of like, if you're able to control the harvest rate at H0, if this is something that, if H0 is a variable that's under your control, you would be able to monitor that and ensure that you don't let that get too high. And if you can just maintain that at H0, then this amount of fish, you'll get this amount of fish added every single year. You'll harvest that amount of fish every single year, and that will be kind of a stable level of population that you could maintain indefinitely. And maybe there's a risk, maybe there's a little bit higher of a risk that you maybe slip down too low if something happens unexpected. Which if something happens unexpected at XH, maybe you have a little bit more cushion. That could be a reason why XH could be preferable. There's still something else that is important specifically for the economics of fishing. Anyone have any idea what that would be?
Isn't XH a higher value than XL? So XH, you would essentially be harvesting a larger amount of fish because it's further right on the scale.
So I'm glad you brought that up. It's a larger stock, but the harvest, the sustainable harvest that's possible is actually exactly the same. So under this scenario, I'm kind of assuming that in both cases, you are only harvesting the new growth every single year. You're keeping the stock intact at XH or XL, and the harvest that you do is only equal to the amount of the extra fish that are reproduced. So in that case, both of these actually produce the same amount of fish every single year. So those aren't actually different in terms of the sustainable harvest amounts. Does that make sense, Kenny?
Yeah.
But I'm glad you brought that up, because that's an important point here, is that both of these have exactly the same sustainable harvest amounts that are possible. So from an economic perspective, XH is actually preferable. You could also maybe think of it just like the species level, or, the amount of the species is closer to, what would occur naturally. And so maybe there's some preference for having a level of fish stock that's closer to the biological equilibrium, and that's somehow a little bit more in balance with the natural ecosystem. That's one argument. The economic argument, though, is that at XH, you have way more fish just sort of available out in the sea. So if you are, if you have your boat, let's say you have your net, and you're trying to catch these fish. If you have a small fish stock, it's going to be a lot harder to find fish. This guy on the left is going to have to put a lot less effort forward in order to catch the same amount of fish. So if they're both going to try to catch H0, they're both sort of committing themselves to catching H0 because they're both committing to a sustainable harvest. But the guy on the left here is just going to have to put a lot less effort relative to the guy on the right. The guy on the right is going to have to just spend a lot more time in order to achieve a catch equal to H0 because the fish are sparser, the population is lower, and it's just harder to find. It's harder to find the fish. You have to exert more effort in order to get the same amount of fish. Whereas the guy on the left doesn't have to exert as much effort because the fish are more likely to just come to him because there's a lot more available. You're more likely to randomly run into a fish with a higher stock level, say at XH, as opposed to a lower stock level at XL. That's kind of the economic argument for why XH is preferable to XL. Does that make sense? Does that concept make sense? Are there any questions about that? All right, excellent. We got a thumbs up from Kenny. There is, before I get into the full-blown economic analysis, I just want to point out there is one kind of other point on this curve that is perhaps biologically interesting, and that's this point, this stock level here, which I'm going to call XMSY. MSY stands for maximum sustainable yield. So this stock level XMSY is the point at which the growth rate is highest, the additional fish per year is highest. And so if you were to maintain your stock level at XMSY, that would allow for you to achieve the maximum growth rate, or the highest possible sustainable harvest, or the highest possible additional number of fish per year. So from a biological perspective, if you're just interested in having the maximum new fish added to the population every single year, XMSY would be the stock level that would give you that amount. So that's potentially a biologically interesting point because it indicates the maximum possible amount of new fish that you can add every single year. However, there's some economic concepts that are important, which give us a hint as to maybe how to get the most value out of this fishery. So this growth curve, this growth curve with population growth rate on the y-axis and stock on the x-axis, this is kind of this is kind of the foundations, the biological foundations of where we got the total fishery production curve in chapter 4. In this case, we have fishing effort. Well, actually, let me go back. This is if you remember from chapter 4, we had a curve that looked something like this, where we looked at the total production of the fishery, and that was a function of fishing effort, or in that case, we had like the number of boats that were out on the open sea going out to fish. We had number of boats on the x-axis, and total production that was possible on the y-axis. And we had some curve here. We had some portion of this curve where we had increasing production with fishing effort. We had some point at which that fishing effort led to less and less production. Production sort of reached a peak and then started to decline over time. That curve we saw in chapter 4 is the mirror image of this fishery growth curve that we just derived based on biological principles. So this green curve is like the mirror image of that fishery production curve from chapter 4. It's the mirror image because in this case, on this curve, we have fish population, or the fish stock, increasing from left to right, whereas in the previous curve we had sort of the fish population decreasing from left to right. Now we have fish population increasing from left to right, and fishing effort increasing from right to left. You can think of this as like as we go from this this line here. This represents the like zero fishing effort, because this is where the fish population will naturally just kind of stabilize at. And so if we diminish that stock, that's sort of associated with higher fishing effort. Okay, so that's the sense in which this biological growth curve is actually similar to what we saw in chapter 4, where we were analyzing the economics of a fishery. So keep that in mind. We had total production on the y-axis for that curve, but we also had a version of it where we multiplied that by the price of fish, or dollars per fish. And so if we take production measured in units of fish and we multiply it by dollars per fish, we get dollars. So that's how we got this total revenue curve, and that's how we got the total cost curve was also denominated in dollars, the costs of fishing. So let us use those concepts, use those economics concepts. We can recognize that more intense fishing effort results in a smaller stock. So we still have total fish stock on the x-axis, and we can recognize that fishing effort is increasing as we move from right to left. And what that's going to imply is that, again, we have zero fishing effort at x max, at the natural stable, sort of the stable population size. What that implies is that as we move from right to left, we're going to get increasing costs, because this implies larger fishing effort. So the blue curve are the extra costs, the extra total costs that are incurred each year in order to achieve a certain sustainable fish harvest. The green curve is before the green curve was sort of the additional fish that were added per year. Now we're getting, we sort of took those additional fish per year, we multiplied them by dollars per fish in order to get the total revenue that would be possible each additional year. That's sort of how we got from additional fish per year to additional revenue per year. And then to find well, before I get into the economically optimal level, let me just point out that this stock level XOA, which I'm gonna use to represent the open access equilibrium, this stock level XOA is what would prevail under an open access regime, and that's the point where total revenue is equal to total costs. Remember from chapter 4, we had the idea that if we had a case where total revenue was greater than total costs, that would induce more boats to want to go out to fish. That would incentivize more fishing effort, as long as there were positive profits to be had. And if there was no restriction on the number of fish, a situation where there was total revenue exceeding total cost would lead to more boats. And so that would eventually lead to an open access equilibrium where we have a small stock of fish. The fish stock would be reduced to a low level, and we would have some amount of sustainable harvest per year. But this would be at a very low fish population level, and as we saw in chapter 4, and as we kind of just saw a little bit a second ago in thinking about why this low level of stock could be not economically optimal, but that's not economically optimal because it's possible to reduce fishing effort and also increase fishing revenue. Revenue is higher at a lower level of fishing, and also the total costs of fishing are lower. And so we can actually increase total profit that's possible by shifting away from that low stock equilibrium or the high fishing effort equilibrium or the open access equilibrium. We can increase our profit overall. The total fishery profit can be increased by reducing below that open access equilibrium to something a little bit less. That's an idea that we had seen in chapter 4, which is coming back now in kind of the full-blown analysis of fisheries in chapter 18. So the economic optimum, that's going to be occurring at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So the way we can find that point is by finding the point where the slope of the total cost curve is equal to the slope of the total revenue curve. And so the way that I do that, one way that I can do that is I can take this total cost curve, I can copy it. It's going to have the same slope. And I'm just trying to find the point. I'm trying to shift this curve up, trying to find the point where the slopes of these two curves are the same. And the slopes of those two curves are the same right about there. Right about the harvest level here, which is associated with a equilibrium population level of X star. So X star is going to be allowing you to produce a certain number of extra fish per year according to the additional fish that are produced given by that growth rate curve. And that will be the economic optimum. That will be the point where the total revenue that we can get per year, the extra fish that we can harvest per year, the difference between those total revenues and the total costs, the gap between those two are going to be driven as wide as possible. If we have a level of fishing that's at X star, that's the widest gap between total revenue and total cost. That's going to be the level of fishing and the amount of the fish stock that will maximize the total value of the fishery. In fact, there are two different levels of annual harvest. Just as we saw before, there are X star is associated with some optimal harvest level. I'm going to call that optimal harvest level annual harvest star, or you could also think of this as H star. That's a little easier to say. H star is the sustainable harvest associated with X star, the fishing stock X star, or the population level X star. But H star is also associated with a smaller stock, X bar. X bar and X star both have the same level of sustainable harvest that's possible. But the reason that X bar is not economically optimal is that the costs are a lot higher. The revenues are the same. The sort of the annual revenues that are possible at X bar are the same as what are possible at X star, but the total costs are a lot higher at X bar. At X bar, you exert a lot more fishing effort. You use a lot more boats. You fish a lot more intensely, you incur more costs, and you could get the same revenue, you could get the same extra harvest per year by just shifting a little bit to the right from X bar to X star, and your revenues could stay constant, but your costs could be a lot lower. And so that's why X star is a lot more economically efficient than X bar. That's bringing in some of the economics. So the economics brings in not just the growth rate of the fishery, and not just the sustainability of the fishery, but also the costs that are associated with fishing when the stock level is at a certain amount.
Wait, so the total revenue per year curve, the one that looks like the biological curve, the reason that it's your total, that they're related is because like the total revenue is a function of the biological growth rate? Yeah,
this is like kind of one of the underlying assumptions here is I'm thinking about any of these levels of revenue would be sustainable, because the growth rate curve tells us that number of additional fish will be reproduced every single year. So any level on that curve is something that can be sustained. That fish population can reproduce itself every single year at that level. And so those total revenues are sort of like equal to the stable level of harvest that are possible that are associated with that fish stock. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and if you were to like implement this in a real like situation, like it could base like year to year if the total cost change or something like that, you would kind of change your position of harvesting, I guess, because it might like if prices go up or something like that.
Right. Yeah. I guess the way that this is kind of done in practice is the conditions in the fishery are changing. The fish populations are naturally maybe growing or shrinking according to just amounts of predators or the availability of prey for that particular species. So you can have fluctuations in the biology, and you'd want to maybe you'd want the total allowable catch each year to maybe change according to those conditions. It might not be the fact that the fish population will exactly stay constant for a given harvest rate. Conditions in the environment might be changing such that in one year you might want to reduce the total allowable catch a little bit because of those changing conditions, or maybe you'd want to increase it a little bit, or maybe you'd feel at liberty to increase it a little bit because the fish grew a little bit more the previous year than you were expecting. So you can, in reality, you could have this total allowable catch. You could have this level. I called it H star before. You could have that level. Sometimes that's called the total allowable catch. And instead of just being a constant level every year, that could be something that you consult with conservation biologists and fish experts to kind of get a sense for, does that total allowable catch for this year have to be a little bit lower because of environmental conditions, or could we maybe increase it a little bit this year? So that can go up and down according to kind of your real-time assessments of the fish population. So you might get together and decide at the beginning of the season, we're going to make our total allowable catch equal to X this year, which might be a little bit lower than what it was previously, but we're doing that because we noticed that there's, the population has been shrinking a little bit relative to last year. Or we might make it a little bit higher according to what the population level is. So yeah, in real life, you could set that total allowable catch sort of every single season, every single year. You'd have a new level kind of based on changing conditions. Any other questions about this economic model of the fishery?
Could you explain one more time how you shifted the total cost per year curve?
Yeah, for sure. So it's not a literal shift like in changing any real world variables. It's just simply what you want to find is the point where the slope of the total cost curve is equal to the slope of the total revenue curve. So let me clean this up just a little bit and do that again. So what I just did here is I can copy this, and I get a curve that has exactly the same slope, and I just want to find where on the total revenue per year curve, where on this green curve does the slope of these two lines match. And it turns out that there's exactly one point where the slope matches, and it's roughly right there. So that's how I defined the or how I determined what the economically optimal is. I found the point at which the slope of the total cost curve is equal to the slope of the total revenue curve. It's not literally shifting it in real life. It's just this is just kind of a graphical trick to find that point where those two slopes are equal. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So the issues that we were just analyzing with that economic model those have to do with the total supply of fish and kind of managing the stock of fish optimally over time. Another kind of issue that could come into play, which is more under the rubric of externalities, is this idea of bycatch, which is like collateral damage, which occurs over the course of a fishing season. So this would be an example of like dolphins that are harmed or killed in the course of tuna fishing. So as the tuna industry tries to capture and harvest tuna, there's dolphins that are harmed and potentially killed in the process of that. And that's kind of an example of bycatch. Anytime you have a species of fish that wasn't the target species that you're trying to catch, but is either you catch it and maybe you release it, but it dies after you release it because of the trauma. Anytime you have sort of species that were not your target species that you still ended up catching and harming, that's bycatch. And one of the solutions to that, it's difficult to regulate that directly, but one of the solutions that's kind of emerged sort of in a bottom-up way is this idea of eco-labeling, certifying companies or certifying fishing practices which don't have those collateral damages that are commonly found in that industry. So eco-labeling is kind of a certification system that sends a signal to consumers about the externalities or lack of externalities associated with a particular fishing practice. And it's kind of a voluntary mechanism where certain consumers with a certain level of consciousness about those sorts of issues will be willing to pay a premium for that. And that's been an effective way to artificially kind of increase the price of fishing and make it so that those companies have an incentive to try to limit bycatch, try to limit collateral damage in order to qualify for kind of an eco label, which will allow them to fetch a little bit of a premium on the open market. That's one way that, again, it's not directly top-down regulation, but it's one way that it's one sort of institution that's emerged in order to cope with this issue of collateral damage in fishing behavior. Another policy issue that I wanted to bring up, which I think is really interesting, is that the typical way that these fisheries are managed is through limitations on the length of the season. That's the season limits technique, which will put a limit on how long you can fish over the course of the year. And what's happened is, there's been limitations on the season length, which has incentivized fishermen to try to build bigger boats, build more powerful boats with bigger engines and higher capacities so that they can make the most out of that shorter season. As they do that, as everybody starts to build up capacity, then they have more fishing that occurs, and so they have to actually shrink the length of the season a little bit shorter. And that incentivizes building bigger boats, building more powerful boats, building higher capacity boats. And that means they have to shrink the season even further because now they have, they can race out into the ocean and catch even more fish than they could before. So they have to reduce the season length even further. And what that's led to is, some instances you have the fishing season being reduced from months down to weeks, eventually down to days, and in some cases there's been some fishing seasons that have been just like 24 hours or even less than that, because people have built up such powerful fleets and they race out to fish so quickly to try to catch as many fish as they can in that tiny window. And it has all these awful consequences, which could be eliminated if you regulated the particular thing that you care about, which is the number of fish. So ultimately, the season limits are a proxy, or are like a regulatory proxy for what you really care about. What you really care about is the number of fish that are caught over the season. One of the ways to do that is by shrinking the season length, but you could be a lot better off by just regulating the thing that you care about more directly, by regulating the number of fish that are caught. And that's what fish shares or catch shares does, is it actually regulates, it gives quotas to individual fishermen about how much they can catch, and it lets them decide however they want to, like when they want to go out and fish, and it doesn't have to be in a restricted time period. So one of the drawbacks of these season limits, as I kind of have been hinting at, is you get this overcapitalization where people just start build bigger and bigger boats, more powerful and more powerful boats, to try to squeeze as much out of the narrow, short fishing season as they can. And you get a lot of unnecessary investment. Those investments in those massive engines, those huge boats with massive engines that can get out to sea very quickly and are able to be large and have a lot of storage space so they can hold a lot of fish inside of them, those wouldn't be necessary. Those investments wouldn't be necessary if you're able to spread your catch out a little bit more evenly over the entire course of the year. So that actually ends up with, it's kind of an arms race situation. It's not efficient for anybody to make those investments, but if the season is limited, then people sort of feel compelled to do so, because if they don't build up their fishing fleet into these massive, powerful boats, then their competitors will, and their competitors will be able to get more fish than they can in that small window of time. So you lead to this overcapitalization scenario. You also get this scenario where these fishermen take on enormous safety risks fishing in these very short periods of time. Like it's a race. It's a race to fish. So you're trying to catch as many fish as you can in that short period, and you only have the fishing period for a set number of days or weeks during the year. And if there's, like, for example, if there's a hurricane during that time span, you can't fish outside of that fishing season. And so your incentive is just to continue to try to plow through the hurricane and do your best to catch as many fish while the hurricane is there, because you don't want to wait till the hurricane's over, because you've sort of wasted some of your fishing season time. And so you are really incentivized just to try to push as fast as you can in that narrow window. So you have a lot of safety risks because of this rapid fishing. And then you also get market gluts, where all of the fish will be caught in a couple weeks. If the season length is a couple weeks long, you get all the fish caught over a couple weeks. The price of fish plummets, and so it's not helpful for the fishermen themselves. They have to sell their fish at kind of depressed prices because all the fish are being sold kind of all at once. And then the fish have to be, some of them can be eaten right then for fresh fish, but then you have all this excess fish, which has to be frozen in order to be eaten, at other times of the year. So you end up with a case where it's not good for the producer or the consumer, because the consumer gets fresh fish for, just a narrow band of time throughout the year, and then they have to eat frozen fish for the remaining part of the year. If you have a scenario here where you're not incentivized to catch fresh fish in a sort of a more spread out, evenly distributed way throughout the season or throughout the year. So these are ways in which the season limits are just not a very good policy relative to something that would actually target exactly what you are hoping for targeting, which was the actual catch of the fish themselves. We're at the end of class today. I'll just recap this fishing policy stuff a little bit before we start class next.